Thanks for that intro. That is great. And it gets me thinking. Your motivations, it's infectious, right? And again, keep coming back to the youth voice,
Yeah.
but it's that energy and that drive and that ownership, right? Like you said, truly stakeholder. So fantastic. Now I want to dive into your experience insofar as that experience. And you mentioned COP. You mentioned you were at Katowice in 18, Glasgow in 21.
And Sharm el-Sheikh
And
last
Sharm
year.
el-Sheikh last year. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Okay, so I'm going to ask you questions around specifically. I really want to get your opinion on the continuation of that youth voice. How has that evolved across those 3 time points? Let's just say across the COP. That's question one. Unpack that for me?
Yeah, sure. I think just to give some context, I was part of this delegation that went to COP to represent and learn from the global youth voices, represent Singapore at the global youth voices, and learn from them to bring back certain lessons to environmentalists in Singapore to say, how is the world seeing Singapore and what role can they play? And at the same time, we were engaging with the negotiators from Singapore, who at COP, by the way, were very, very welcoming. I think this is one of those things where you have the ability to access very, very high-level decision makers if you put yourself out there. And I remember in Poland, it's cold. You could not walk without 3 layers. It was absolutely brutal. But you had this sort of, that was the first time I went to a COP, extremely overwhelmed. And part of the youth NGOs, so they're called Youngo, attending the meetings and realizing these are extremely well-versed, highly intelligent youths who've made it here to represent voices.
Yeah, like the creme de la creme. Yeah,
and they are not joking around.
No. They mean business. Yeah. I've been so impressed. I'm like, oh my goodness, it's kind of
it's quite
intimidating a little bit
the first time you go. But so that's definitely one of them. Another thing I learned is they have so much resources. So they do year-round webinars. They do they're very, very community heavy, and it's all international.
Awesome.
So nobody is actually, before COVID, they were all virtually meeting on Skype, and that was the way everybody coordinated.
Sure.
So putting that aside, I think just the perception and inclusion of youth voices within the COP process has been very, very positive in my experience. I can't speak for everybody because I do know a lot of youth voices feel disappointed.
Of course, because in the speed of action.
The speed of action and just the kind of meandering that has been done by a lot of political voices and also a lot of businesses, and that is frustrating. So don't
That's
let me.
What happens with multi-stakeholder engagement. It's a little bit not only daunting, but it can be a letdown because of the glacial pace of the discussions.
And COP is slow.
Oh, COP is a big circus.
It is.
And that's a massive one.
I'm a big fan of multilateral processes personally, but this is me fully recognizing that the process is not a fast one.
It's slow. It's slow, but by design, because you have to listen to all the different stakeholders and then get a consensus view, and that is difficult. And that's why you mentioned Christiana Figueres, right?
Yeah.
And so many amazing people within the UNFCCC specifically, but broad climate, like you said, from finance, from the world of energy, from the world of NGOs, from the world of private sector enterprise with the ambitions, etc. Everyone being at the table, working together towards a North Star, which is we need to decarbonize, and we need to do it by a certain time frame if we're to avert the worst effects of climate change. We have a 1.5 degree trajectory and a 2 degree trajectory. And they're both ambitious. Yeah, completely.
With this match. But so to take a specific example for Article 6, right? So the youths specifically, what is interesting within the youth collective, you have a global North youth and global South youth.
Oh, that's good.
So you would think the dynamic would not exist. It exists 100% within the youth group. And what is really, really interesting to see is sometimes global North youth find themselves in that position where they're unnecessarily representing global South voices just because they feel that they have better resources. There's an overrepresentation of global North youths than global South youths because of access to resources.
Yeah.
And
that's empathetic. That's good.
But
they're representing the other side as well. Well, no, so the other hemisphere.
Yeah. But the global South wants to represent itself as well, right? So it gets a bit.
I get that point.
It becomes this point where, that global level debate simmers down to the stakeholder voices as well. But having said that, one thing we all agreed on back in Glasgow was that in the past, specifically for certain CDM projects, which is the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, there was this exclusion of human rights. And these examples, that there were certain youths who were directly affected by it, who had very strong voices in our Article 6 youth group. And we recognized that. We said, you know what, this makes a lot of sense, and they're correct that Article 6 needs to include these voices and these issues as a critical part of its, structure. And so we had gone to a lot of different negotiators, without saying who's who, and we were able to, from the usual suspects, get support, and from the usual suspects get absolute silence.
Yeah.
In the end, though, at this point, we don't have an agreement on human rights within the Article 6. And that's something the youths feel very strongly about, because they say you can't solve one problem and create others. And especially where there is, underrepresentation of certain voices, when they are actually standing up and voicing their concern, there is almost an obligation that you are listening to them.
I completely agree. Keep going.
And
fight that fight.
Yeah, and so those are the kind of things you reflect on as you're representing youth voices. There was also some who were very against carbon markets. They said commodification of carbon should be a crime. And you had others who said, you know what, it is something, it's a necessary evil. We have to go forward in it. Why don't we talk about the rules then that dictate it?
Exactly, okay.
And so you would not necessarily find this unanimous, the youth collective voice is also an
divergent.
Requires a lot of, diplomacy, and we have to work within each other.
That's good. I think that level of inclusion, that diversity of thought is excellent, because it then challenges the status quo.
Exactly.
The fact that that there's venues for expressing that voice, B, that it's being heard, and C, that you have the kind of, like you said, and I'd love to dive into this, but you singled out specifically Singapore. Obviously, I think we're really biased living in this awesome country, but you talked about the accessibility to people in pretty senior positions in the ministry, whether it's National Climate Change Secretariat or MTI or Economic Development Board or even Enterprise Singapore here.
Yeah.
They're acting in unison to help to drive towards this North Star around decarbonisation. And little anecdote here, but I've found it amazing that I can reach out on LinkedIn and I'll ping someone really senior. I won't say names, but ministers, people that work in Prime Minister's office. And I'll get a response. And not only will I get a response, I'll get a coffee meeting.
Yeah, wow.
And that's astonishing. Because I'm not a lobbyist, I'm just a guy. And then all of a sudden, they're like, have a conversation, and even sometimes have sought out perspectives.
Yeah.
And that is so humble and actually inspiring that, again, to feel heard. And I can only imagine what that feels like as a youth coalition.
I don't think it was that easy a path. And I will say that in the past, because of the demonstrative nature of youth representation at COP, it was not always an open door. And
okay, so it was more perceived antagonistically?
It was basically like, this part of the world, especially Singapore, the way you interact with the government is very different. And every country has their own format. And in Singapore, if you have a good point, if you have a well-phrased point, there is openness to listen to it. But the representation of voices in a emotional or in an aggressive stance will not be sort of tolerated. So
that's part of the Singaporean experiment, right? Tolerance,
exactly. That's
respect,
the contract you have.
That's the social contract that we sign when
that
we
you have
live
in Singapore. And I think that allows Singapore youth actually to be they're very well positioned, and they've responded to that reality.
Right.
So, the way we, for example, in stakeholder engagements with the government, we had a very open voice, and we were never called into the large boardrooms.
Sure.
We were always called in the offices, ordered some pizza, and talk about those things.
Because but that's casual, that's kind of fun as well.
And you always had young negotiators talking to us, and that set a trust that actually is now blossomed beautifully into something today. So if you look at Sharm
maybe in the future, some of those people become the ministers. They become senior people.
And they should be. I think
that's great.
And what is interesting is, so in Sharm el-Sheikh was the first time Singapore put up a pavilion. And so myself and another youth advocate, we were in charge of curating the Youth Day events at Sharm el-Sheikh. And we had the privilege of going there and organizing everything. And we organized 4 events. We talked about like a hackathon. We did a little small talk on adaptation. We talked about youth voices in representing, in between Africa and Asia, because it was an African COP. It was such a fascinating experience, especially seeing, ministry people for the first time come to COP, and we as youth delegates were their mentors because we had been to COPs before, so and we were explaining to them.
Isn't that a fascinating one?
And I think the fact that they were just, like, okay, teach us was one of the most fascinating things ever.
That's great. I'm so glad that you've gone down that path, and you're going to be an amazing mentor, and I know I already think of you as a leader in this space, so you're made for this. For prime time, you're ready. That's awesome.